For this week, I will be discussing about two articles. The first article is Measuring How Political Parties Keep Their Promises, a Positive Perspective from Political Science. And this article tackles this key question about whether political parties keep their promises and pledges. And the first article is more or less a literature review paper that summarizes some of the conclusions about this topic from previous research. And the second article is a bit different. It employs an original approach to tackle this problem from a new perspective. The first article answers the question about whether political parties actually keep their promises in general. And the second article tackled the question about which types of governments are associated with high or low levels of pledge fulfillments. Okay, so let's start with the setup of this research. So basically, this literature review paper targets at 18 journal articles and book chapters that analyze the problem around pledge fulfillments. As you can see from the headings of the tables on the right-hand side, there are some elements or factors that are identified by the authors to be of importance to this type of pledge fulfillment research. As you can see in the past, the problem wasn't defined and analyzed in an accurate and consistent way, whereas in the more recent era, we can see more accurate and more consistent definitions and operationalization of pledge fulfillments. This operationalization includes how we define a pledge and how we define whether a party has fulfilled its pledge. As you can see on the tables, there are at least two limitations of this research methodology. One is that it only looks at the articles published in English and French and ignores other languages. And the other limitation is that it only looks at specific areas and regions, such as North America and a selected number of countries in Europe. Therefore, we have this representation error of countries only from specific regions of the world, so we cannot generalize the conclusions of this literature review paper to the wider world. And on a side note, not only political science topics about pledge fulfillments, but also on political parties in general, we can find a large proportion of those research only available in English and French, representing and analyzing countries in those areas. As you can see on the table, we need a time period for this type of pledge fulfillment research because we have to wait and see after the parties announce their pledges to see whether they will be fulfilled or not. So to summarize, we can at least identify two trends from the tables on the right-hand side. The first is that the research around pledge fulfillments, they have become more accurate in operationalization. And secondly, over time, the pledge fulfillment rates have increased in general among those areas under studies. If we statistically summarize the pledge fulfillment rates of all the parties and all the countries that are studied by those researchers, we see that parties fulfill 67% of their promises on average. And contrary to popular belief, political parties are quite reliable, and they fulfill more than 50% of their promises on average. And a question that we might ask ourselves is that why we have a negative perception toward politicians regarding their ability to keep their promises. And the authors of this article argues that this is partly because of the media coverage. The media tends to pick very important, significant, or controversial issues and ignores some minor issues that are not of the interest of the citizens. So if we summarize it in ordinary language, we can say that even if a party fulfills all the minor issues pledges, but fails to fulfill a very important issues pledge, the media will still blame on the party heavily. And I want to emphasize that this conclusion about the media coverage problem is not from the perspective of an empirical study. So if we want to empirically test whether this is actually true, we should operationalize the issue's importance. Even though it might be challenging, but by operationalizing the issue's importance, we can see whether parties are more honest or more capable in fulfilling important issues or not. If we look at the research that are summarized by the two authors in this article, we can find that different issues are treated equally, so no importance or weighting are attached to the issue's pledges. After discussing about the general average, now we can extend our discussions to the differences across different regions. So first, a wide variation in the rate of pledge fulfillment by political parties exists, from a minimum of 45%, which can be found in the state of Wisconsin in the United States, to a maximum of 85%, which is in the case of Britain. We can also find that comparing the case of the US to Canada and Britain, we find that US has a lower pledge fulfillment rate. To explain the differences between US and Canada and Britain, the authors provide one possible explanation, which is the contrast between parliamentary and presidential regimes. And the authors argue that parliamentary regimes tend to be better in the performance of fulfilling pledges. However, only by looking at a very small sample of cases of regions, it is very hard for us to generalize this conclusion to other places. Therefore, this is only a general impression of the authors. And actually, the second article that I will be discussing about tackles this problem about different types of governments and regimes in an empirical approach. After looking at the cross-regional differences, we can now see the time series or longitudinal differences. The question is why we observe a tendency for pledge fulfillments to be declining in the recent decades. Can we actually reliably relate this change to parties' performance and parties' ability to keep their promises? The authors argue that this decline is not really about parties' ability to fulfill their pledges. It is actually about researchers' approaches and researchers' accuracy in modeling this problem. Not only that the parties tend to propose their policies in a more detailed and accurate way, but also the researchers tend to apply more sophisticated tests to the pledge fulfillment research they are conducting. So after explaining the contents of the first article, we can move on to talk about some of the possible discussion questions. As I mentioned, the research that are discussed by the two authors is only available in English and French, and they only focus on the research that target at a specific subset of the world. So my question is, how about fulfillments in your own country? Do you have some impression about the fulfillment rates? And secondly, do you know what kind of commitments and promises do the political leaders in your country normally give in the elections? After discussing about the previous literature review paper, I will move on to talk about the second empirical piece of work, which is titled The Program to Policy Linkage, a comparative study of election pledges and government policies in 10 countries. In this empirical paper, the authors employ some regressional tests to see what types of governments are associated with high or low levels of pledge fulfillment rates. As you can see from the table on the left-hand side, 10 countries and 42 governments of those countries are focused in this research. This research not only looks at specific countries, but also classifies the different governments of different countries in different time periods. For example, the researcher classifies parliamentary support by majority and minority, and classifies single-party and coalition governments. On the right-hand side, we can see this integrated analysis of factors affecting presidential and governing parties' pledge fulfillment. For the government type variables, the authors classify them into one reference group, which is coalitions with parliamentary minorities, and then coalitions with parliamentary majorities, single-party minority governments, single-party majority governments, U.S. presidential party with full congressional control, U.S. presidential parties with divided government, and also party that hosts the chief executive and party that hosts the relevant ministerial or departmental portfolio. And also, the author implies two other different factors. One is the GDP growth, representing the economic performance of the governing period. And secondly, whether the government is short-lived or not. Through summarizing the different governments of each country, we can see a general cross-sectional trend across the different countries in analysis. The results show that the highest rate of fulfillment for governing parties is found in the UK, where all 5 governments were single-party governments with parliamentary majorities. And the lowest overall rate of pledge fulfillment for governing parties is in Ireland and Italy. Several of the Irish governments were short-lived, and they were coalitions and were with minority governments. The Italian governments were large and quite broad coalitions. We can also see the position of the US in this trend. US presidential parties fulfilled a higher percentage of their election pledges than governing parties in the Netherlands and Ireland, but less than governing parties in parliamentary systems, where single-party governments are the norm, which are the UK, Sweden, Portugal, and Spain. Some people might think that governments in the US are not so good at fulfilling pledges. However, we can see that US is performing in an average way, and it is positioned in the middle of this trend. After looking at the cross-sectional differences between the different countries in analysis, we can now turn to look at the governmental systems as well as the GDP growth rate and their association with pledge fulfillment rates. And on the left-hand side, you can see that the single majority is the highest in the probability of fulfillment, and the coalition with ministry is the lowest in its probability of fulfilling pledges. And as you can see, on the right-hand side, the GDP growth rate has a moderate effect and a moderate positive effect on the probability of fulfillment. In other words, in the governing period, if the GDP growth rate is quite good, then the fulfillment rate could be higher. So in conclusion, the probability of pledge fulfillment for US presidential parties lies between the extremes of single-party parliamentary governments and coalition governments. This suggests that US presidents are more constrained than governing parties in single-party parliamentary governments, but actually less constrained than many governing parties in multi-party coalitions. And second, the allocation of ministerial portfolios has an impact on pledge fulfillment, with higher probabilities of pledge fulfillment in areas where governing parties control the relevant ministerial or departmental post. And lastly, as I mentioned before, in times of strong economic growth, election pledges are more likely to be fulfilled. The good point about this article is that it not only conducts cross-sectional comparisons on average between different countries' pledge fulfillment rates, but also generalizes the results into different governmental types and analyzes the effect of economic growth on the fulfillment rates. However, the same problems that applied to the first article also applies here, because the sample size of the countries is quite small, so there is also a danger of overgeneralization. Another problem is that it might be a good idea to analyze the different types of pledges, such as economic pledges, social pledges, or environmental pledges. But the difficulty of this approach is that it's hard and difficult for us to generalize the different policies and categorize them into different types. So now, let me address some of the questions that are raised by the classmates in the class on the Moodle. So the first question asked, would it still apply if the election pledges are not directly related to economic performance in terms of the relationship between economic growth rate and the pledge fulfillment rate? Like I mentioned in the last slide, the authors in this article do not categorize different types of policies, whether it's economic, social, or legal, or environmental. So the general conclusion made by the author is not in terms of different types of policies. So on average, economic growth contributes to the pledge fulfillment rate, no matter the pledge is about economy or other things. And for the second question, it asks about the problem of apologizing. If we want to tackle this problem from an empirical or positive point of view, not from a normative point of view, then we should first define clearly, accurately, and operationalize the question of apologizing. What is apologizing? And how we can say if someone actually apologized. And the third question asks about the differences between divided and undivided presidential governments in US. I believe we have answered this question previously on the graph provided by the second article. Another thing I want to mention about the first question and about economic performance is that GDP growth rate is not the only representative factor of the economic performance of a governing period. We should also include factors such as inflation rate, unemployment rate, and government budget deficits. The next question asks about the applicability of this model to dictatorship or military government. As you can see, this article only tackles the democracies, not the non-democratic societies, so we cannot generalize those results to those non-democratic societies. Some countries, like China, it is a one-party system, so it's not a multi-party or bi-party system. And in other cases, like the case of Singapore, it is an uncompetitive party system. So probably some unique observations could be made about those countries. But my general impressionistic answer to this question is probably that for countries with a one-party system or with an uncompetitive party system, the parties do not have a strong incentive to keep their promises. The reason for that is that there is no punishment mechanism or system for the voters to switch to a different party in the next election. And also another question we might ask is that how the dictatorial and military governments actually make pledges in the first place. That is also another thing we can focus on. Do they make pledges in the same way as democratic societies? So in conclusion, from the two articles we've been studying today, we can say that parties and politicians are not so incapable at keeping promises as we previously imagined. And secondly, large variations and differences exist between different countries and between countries with different governments. So it really depends on the regime type and also the government type. Therefore, when we want to evaluate or assess the performance of parties or countries' politics, we shouldn't only rely on statistics of pledge performance because it is largely based on the researchers' calculations and their statistical approaches. We should also importantly look at what types of pledges are actually being proposed in the first place. Parties can essentially avoid having low rates of pledge performance by proposing only minor issues, not important and large issues, whereas other parties might try to abandon certain policies after realizing that its feedback is not so good when we implement those policies. Therefore, we can see that high fulfillment rates doesn't mean that a party is performing so well, and a low pledge fulfillment rate doesn't mean that the party is so bad. Therefore, the self-selection into proposing different policies and pledges is also very important and is a key problem in this analysis.